You'll be a shadow.
All right, so just as an introduction, this is Dr. Ron Burnett. He is our president, and also his new title is Vice Chancellor since we've become a university. I guess it's not that new anymore.
Not that new.
So Ron was involved very handily in helping create our intellectual property policy here at Emily Carr. Under the policy, our vice president, academic, and provost would normally be the person who deals with the intellectual property policy, but since Ron had such a hand in creating this policy, I thought it would be better to have him here to talk about it. So I'm just going to ask him a few questions. We've actually talked a little already about the intellectual property policy, and so just to give us both an idea of how this conversation would go here, but also hopefully at the end you guys might have some questions that I didn't think of, or just some pressing issues that you might want to know about the intellectual property policy here at Emily Carr. So I guess I haven't given you guys the policy, but it is online, and I meant to print it off, but the camera business made everything so much more difficult. So in the policy, it kind of outlines the guidelines by which the university chooses things, I guess to deem whether or not they are within the purview of the university to take an interest in. And that's basically what the policy does. And so I guess the first question I would have that you should answer is, why do we have a policy? Why do we need a policy?
First of all, it's his birthday today.
I
can't
Happy birthday.
So you can't see, nothing is private in a world of open source.
And if we were lucky, we could play it under the guise of fair dealing because it's an educational purpose.
That's right. And he cannot, yeah, right, he cannot say anything against that. That's a good one. Why don't I step back and just introduce some of the process, because the answer to that question lies in the process. So, two anecdotes. The first, in the mid-90s, there was a student working in industrial design, a really interesting student whose father had died some years earlier from brain cancer. And his primary memory of that process was that his father was more terrified of the MRI tunnel machine than he was of the cancer. So that was sort of this metaphor that stuck in his mind about that experience. And he set about prototyping a new kind of MRI machine without any inherent knowledge of technology of radiology or any of the kinds of things that you would normally need to know in order to make a machine of that sort. And over the course of a summer, he was playing around with the design and came up with the donut design that is now ubiquitous in MRI machinery. As it happened during the period in which he was working on that, a Mitsubishi representative, and there are many of the various international companies who wander around here quite discreetly, by the way, was wandering around and noticed this work, talked to the student, and the student was very forthcoming, just talked about his father and why he was motivated and all that stuff. And the guy walked away. Who is the biggest manufacturer of the donut machine in the world? Mitsubishi. So neither the student nor Emily Carr benefited from one of the biggest and most profitable inventions of the last 25 years. Major invention. And the implications of that are not minor, because they raise issues around what creativity is about and how to harness it for the benefit of the creators, as well as for the benefit of the context in which the creation took place. It's a very complex issue. So I'll give you another anecdote, and then I'll come back to that, and then I'll start to answer your question. The second anecdote was a meeting that students had here some years ago where there was this kind of rumor going around. It's a typical broken telephone kind of rumor that the institution was going to impose retrospective IP on people who had become quite, like the example was Doug Copeland. You know, Doug Copeland has made millions and millions of dollars on his creativity in every medium. So, you know, there's this like thing, like, wow, retrospective IP, which I'd never heard of before. In fact, I haven't heard since. This was somebody, I think, creating an art project on IP, because there's no such thing as retrospective IP, really. That's an impossibility. But it was interesting that the rumor circulated with enough intensity that it was actually a student meeting. And there was some very, very heated exchanges in that meeting, because there was a sense that, you know, gee, Big Daddy's going to come and take back something that happened, you know, 10 or 15 years ago. In fact, when Doug and I are good friends, when I saw Doug Copeland, who's the author of Generation X and many other books, I said to him, you know, there's a bill in the mail, which I did send him, you know, carefully framed invoice for $2.25 million for all of IP. And I said, this is retrospective IP as defined by an art institution. And he laughed. So the answer to the...
Was he a student here?
He was a student here. He was part of a group of students in the mid-'80s who graduated between 85 and 88, all of whom become multimillionaires in their art form. So your future looks bright.
I think Stan was part of that class as well.
Yeah, yeah. Very famous artists came out of that particular group. Generation X, if you read it, by the way, is a conversation taking place at Emily Carr. That's all it is. So there's something about the book that nobody knows, which is that it's really just an internal kind of metaphor for the experience that you still may be having, because the 80s are different from this time. What was the question again?
Why do we need a policy? Why do we need an intellectual property policy?
We need a policy because the Mitsubishi experience on the one side means that we need to protect students from that kind of potential abuse. And that's an important part of kind of like being aware and being conscious of the implications of something that you think is very playful and may in fact have greater value. On the flip side of that, we need a policy to declare that there shouldn't be a policy. You can't actually, you have to have something that says something in order for there to be some freedom to pursue anything else. So the policy is actually a very open policy in its present form. It was designed to, following along with open source, like this student was talking about, this individual was talking about in the video. The model really is ultimately that the creator has full control in most instances, most of the time. So you have to have a policy that says that. The difficulty comes, the difficult sort of side of it comes into play when, for example, your use of equipment and space and teaching and learning in a very, very direct sense can be linked in a linear fashion to what you have created. And then the question, which is only a question up for discussion, is, well, do we share the benefits together? But that's only up for discussion. It's not imposed as a given. And that's a difference in the policy, because the policy is based on the notion that freedom of expression and freedom of creation are the fundamental ground upon which creativity actually can be nurtured and grown. So that's roughly speaking why we need a policy on both sides of the equation. One is protection, one is freedom. And recognize the important distinction here. Freedom is always the recognition of constraint. It's not something absolute. There's no such thing as an absolute freedom to do anything. And so if you have a notion in your mind of sort of absolute there, you'll get into trouble. So there's always going to be constraints, but it's a matter of how those are managed. And certainly from the perspective, I think, of Emily Carr, the management of that is to give everyone who works here, faculty as well, and staff and students, the greatest amount of freedom possible to create.